Chinese President Xi Jinping renews calls for globalization and international partnerships at a major economic summit in Russia. Hello, I'm Anton, and this is The Heat. World leaders gathered this week for the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum in Russia. This year's theme was New Opportunities in a New World. Russian leader Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping were among those who addressed delegates on Friday, both highlighting challenges to global growth and offering possible solutions. We begin with this report from Liu Jiaxin.
Upon invitation, President Xi Jinping virtually attended and addressed the plenary session of the 25th St. Petersburg International Economic Forum. In his speech, President Xi pointed out that the world is faced with major changes and a pandemic both unseen in a century. But the challenges, as he puts it in a Chinese saying, are also opportunities.
It is important to strengthen soft connectivity of development policies and international rules and standards, reject attempts at decoupling, supply disruption, unilateral sanctions and maximum pressure, remove trade barriers, keep global industrial and supply chains stable, tackle the worsening food and energy crises, and revive the world economy.
President Xi said it's important to follow true multilateralism and increase the voice of emerging markets and developing countries in global economic governance. He also stressed the need to strengthen development partnerships such as North-South and South-South cooperation. Speaking of economic globalization, he said it's important to strengthen soft connectivity of policies and international rules and standards. He says it's vital to reject attempts at decoupling, supply disruptions, and unilateral sanctions. He also supports removing trade barriers, tackling the worsening food and energy crisis, and reviving the world economy. Moreover, he mentioned the importance of innovation and further exchange among the countries. At the end of his speech, President Xi pointed out that the fundamentals of the Chinese economy, its strong resilience, enormous potential, and long-term sustainability remain unchanged. He said China stands ready to work with Russia and all other countries to explore development prospects. Liu Jiaxin, CGTN, St. Petersburg.
To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Beijing, China, Victor Gao is Chair Professor at Soochow University. From Reston in Virginia, we are joined by Michael Maloof. He is a former senior Pentagon strategic analyst here in Washington, D.C. Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And from Moscow, Russia, we are joined by Dmitry Babich. He is a journalist and Russian political analyst. Welcome to all of you. Dmitry Babich, this international gathering has come at a very crucial time. We know that the international economy right now is facing many challenges. Growth forecasts have been downgraded. Many countries are in the grip of inflation. There's food insecurity, which have been exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, there are those supply chain issues, which started during the pandemic and have not gone away. So how did this conference address those issues?
Well, I think it's interesting that despite all the problems, this conference was actually held, because let me remind you that usually St. Petersburg Economic Forum was attended by thousands of guests from the United States, from the European Union. Now, there are, of course, very few such guests. First, because the EU closed its skies to Russia, so it's pretty difficult to travel. You need to go through Istanbul and other directions. And so it was amazing that this forum actually took place. On the other hand, there was a lot of business activity. There were a lot of deals signed, this time not only between various sectors inside the former Soviet Union, the so-called Eurasian economic space, but also with Chinese participants, with participants from India and from other countries of Asia. It was interesting, the speech of President Putin. First, it took place 1 hour later because of hackers attacks that reminded us of many attacks that Russia faced since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, new war in Ukraine on the 24th of February. Let me remind you that actually the war has been going on since 2014. And Putin appeared to be angry and somewhat, I would say, disturbed. He was not in his usual element in the beginning of his speech. He kept kind of arguing with presumed opponents, saying that it was not Russia who is to blame for the current difficulties of the world economy. It was the other side, the countries that imposed sanctions on Russia. But with time, Putin got back into his element, and towards the end of his presentation, towards the end of his appearance, which was pretty long, about 2 hours, he was back in his element, answering all the questions, including some very difficult ones. And I think that the speech of the Chinese leader had a very positive effect, And the presence of the president of Kazakhstan, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, let me remind you that Kazakhstan is an ally of Russia, a traditional ally on the territory of the former Soviet Union. That also had a positive influence on Putin. It was visible. So that's what I can say about this, about the general framework of this conference.
Viktor Gar, this conference also, in a way, cements the ties between Russia and China, doesn't it? As Dmitry told us a moment ago, President Xi Jinping addressed the conference. The two countries also signed some agreements on energy and on food. But beyond those agreements itself, what is the significance of these burgeoning ties between the two countries?
Well, first of all, I think President Xi Jinping's speech at the St. Petersburg Forum is very important and very timely, mainly because the world is really at a tipping point. And there are forces which push the world into war, and China is calling for peace. And China projects the image of great confidence and willingness to commit itself to the continued globalization and economic exchanges between and among countries of all kinds. And China is opposed to separating the world into different blocks or the resurrection of a Cold War in the world. In this sense, I think President Xi Jinping talks about the future and the better future, not only for China or for Russia, but for the whole world. And this is very important because the world seems to be really crippled with escalating crises in terms of the financial crisis, energy crisis, food crisis, and war or peace, for example. And this will really be very, very dangerous because we are just, very short distance away from complete escalation of the current war in Ukraine into something much bigger. His Holiness the Pope already declared that the world is already in the Third World War. Now, we don't need to refuse to give heed to what His Holiness has said about this subject. He has his view of the world, and we do not want to take more risk to push the world really into the Third World War. So I think President Xi Jinping is really projecting a lot of confidence and is talking about the positive side, the constructive side. And this also involves China and Russia, the two great countries on the Eurasian continent, and their relations has been normal and constructive ever since 1989, and there is no reason why these two countries should forfeit their good neighborly relations and very mutually beneficial economic and trade relations.
Michael Maloof, there were hardly any Western nations at this conference in St. Petersburg. In fact, the Western media have been downplaying the significance of this conference as well. The Reuters news agency, in fact, called this conference a meeting of leaders but bereft of the elite, a reference to the fact that there were no Western leaders at the meeting. But does it really underline the divisions that we have been seeing for some time right now between a US-led bloc on the one hand and the rest of the world on the other?
Yeah, I think the Western media's portrayal of this conference is once again points out how they look at things just in a one-sided way. It's very myopic. It's only from their from their Western standpoint, but I think it actually was very, very significant. Even though Westerners did not attend, or most Westerners did not attend, you still had quite a number of other countries there. And you also had a lot of countries, or a lot of companies within Russia and elsewhere that were involved in something that is really very dynamic. Because what Mr. Putin announced was that this conference really reflects the end of the unipolar world order. And we are seeing a multipolar world order, which is comprised of countries such as Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, and for that matter, all the members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They're all coming in on this now. And that this does represent a major sea change to take the world out from a dependency and dominance of the US-led unipolar world order and its financial system, and creating something entirely different for the rest of the world. And when you combine the SCO members along with the Eurasian Economic Cooperation, the BRICS countries, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, you're talking about countries that represent more than half the population of the world. And I think within a 30-year period, you're going to see a very dynamic world change as a consequence. And the Ukrainian situation was just the tip of the iceberg of this thing. This was inevitable, because you had the U.S. pushing even the European countries toward a confrontation with Russia, and at the same time wanted to have a confrontation with China over Taiwan, and in effect creating conditions for many fronts, war fronts, as a consequence at the same time. Whereas we're seeing the efforts with the Belt and Road Initiative and these other enterprises, particularly led by China and Russia, creating an atmosphere for more constructive indigenous development programs rather than destructive, which has become the mantra of the United States over the past 20 years. And people want a change. They want to better their lives. They don't want to be living under the dominance of a US-led economic system that has now become weaponized against them. And they're now reacting as a consequence.
Anton, Fedyashin, what are your thoughts on this changing, evolving world order? I mean, as Michael just told us, we're seeing the end of the unipolar world, aren't we? And that is something that has been going on for some time. I mean, it's being replaced. That order has been in place for a long time. What are your thoughts on it?
As I've said on previous occasions, Anton, first of all, the war in Ukraine is acting as a catalyst and speeding up processes, as you correctly mentioned that it started before. If you look at the theme, sort of the title of this year's forum, which could be best translated as New World, New Opportunities, or New Possibilities, it's remarkably optimistic. Now, of course, you would expect that from a country that's attempting to use an event to basically sell itself. But it's remarkable that there was a lot of talk today about a new globalization, not a deglobalization, but simply a new form, a reformatted globalization. It seems to me that the countries on the outside of the golden billion or the Western world are not looking to reverse the processes from which they have profoundly benefited over the past century, give or take. They're simply decentering it because before, globalization was centered on the West. The United States was in the middle of it, and for good reason. It had by far the most powerful economy after the devastation of the Second World War, and the most stable currency. And then around it was a circle of close allies. Then there was the second socialist world. Then there was everyone else. Well, that model really is in the process of changing. And again, by the theme of the the forum, the Russians and the others, especially the most important guests today, Kazakhs, the Chinese. By the way, the president of Egypt also recorded a greeting. They are looking to figure out how to continue with globalization, but have more of a role in writing the rules. And the other thing that struck me today is Putin speaking about the blowback from the sanctions. Listen, those of us who follow recent events know that many countries in the world have been sanctioned. There's a long list of them. Not only by the West, but by the West also, of course, and primarily. And up to today, you know, sanctions imposed either on apartheid South Africa in the 80s or on North Korea or Syria or Venezuela or a whole bunch of countries really had no noticeable effect on the rest of the world. Russia today is the most sanctioned nation in the history of our planet. Almost 11,000 different sanctions on individuals, companies, and sectors. But for the first time in history, we are seeing phenomenal blowback from the sanctions upon the countries that are imposing them. And that really is something new. Before, the countries I had mentioned, Venezuela, North Korea, had pursued, you know, adaptive policies to try to survive, but they didn't have much of an impact on the rest of the world. But Russia's adaptive behavior today is having some very important formative impacts on the global economy because it's contributing to the decentering of globalization. And that really is a very important global phenomenon. So for all we know, and it's impossible to tell now, of course, with certainty, but this forum may be the beginning of a new era.
Dmitry Babich, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been talking about sanctions. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
The whole basis for Western sanctions was built on the false premise that the Russian economy is not sovereign and is critically vulnerable. They were so caught up in spreading myths about Russia being backward and weak in terms of world trade and economy that they began to believe it themselves. When planning their economic blitzkrieg, they neglected and simply ignored the real facts.
So, Dmitry, as Anton pointed out, Russia is facing very, very harsh sanctions from Western nations led by the United States. Washington has also cut Russia out of the international payment system. But what is the view from Moscow? Does Moscow feel that this was a miscalculation, that it has backfired?
Yes, and we are surprised ourselves to see how much it backfires. In fact, Putin said it about the foreign enemies of Russia, that they thought that Russian economy was not sovereign, that it was not self-sufficient. Well, it was not only the foreigners. A lot of liberal media in Russia have been saying that for 35 years. You know, they started saying it under Gorbachev, that we were somehow inferior to the Western world. In fact, you know, the problems that we had and a very strong inferiority complex that former Soviet citizens have had towards the West, now we understand that it was not explained by some kind of deficiency of Russians or other ethnic groups that lived on the territory of the Soviet Union. It was basically, you know, our poverty stemmed from monopoly. It stemmed from monopoly. It stemmed from lack of respect for private property that had been shown by Bolsheviks for many years. And now it's very important what Putin said. Now it is the West that shows that tendency towards monopoly. Now it is the United States and the EU who are showing disrespect for private property. Basically, Putin repeated it several times, that even those entrepreneurs who were actually Russian but pro-Western and who kept their assets in the West, they got their property confiscated. It was sometimes frozen, sometimes just taken away from them, but they lost their property without any court orders, without committing any crimes. And this damaged the reputation of the West, not only among Russians in general, but also among the liberal part of the Russian population, including people living outside Russia, including especially Russians living in the West. And the other important thing was that a lot of people expected Putin to respond to the Western pressure in the old Soviet way, you know, saying that, okay, we need to nationalize the economy, goodbye private property, goodbye entrepreneurship, let's all have some kind of a rationing system, we have limited resources. No, the message from Putin was quite the opposite.
Right.
First, he said that we're not going to isolate ourselves. He said that Russia is not going to live in an autarky. Second, he said that we need to develop small business, big business. We need to develop entrepreneurship, a very non-Soviet answer to the challenge, a very non-Soviet response.
Okay.
And also, I think it was Putin's idea. I think it was his idea to have the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi speaking at that forum right at the moment when Putin was there. It was obviously pleasant for Putin to see the Chinese leader Xi Jinping take the floor, okay, virtually by you know, a computer connection, but everyone was very happy and captivated by the Chinese leader appearing on the screen.
Okay.
So the response was very non-Soviet, and the response is, well, yes, we are going to have a globalization. We are going to go outside, but not in the old way.
Okay, Victor Gao, you know, Anton was talking a moment ago about globalization, and that is something that China has championed over the past 4 decades. And in those 4 decades, it's emerged as a major economic power in the world. But looking at these divisions in the world right now, which are widening all the time, what is the future of globalization?
Indeed, China has been a major promoter and champion of globalization up to today. And I truly believe China will remain the champion going forward, because it is the megatrend of our time, despite of whatever that is happening since the beginning of this year, that the people in the world still want to have peace rather than have war. So we do not need to be agitated that much by the warmongers in the world. And we also believe that Cold War is not good for the West as well as for the rest of the world. Therefore, continued and the more advanced phases of globalization is a must. This is exactly what President Xi Jinping mentioned in his important speech at the forum, that we want to have more international cooperation with each other. And we do not want to be separated into different blocks competing against each other in a hostile way. And we do not want to see the disruption of supply chains, for example. And I think this indicates that certain countries in the world feel that they are disadvantaged by the globalizations, and they want to turn the table on globalization, and they want to accuse countries like China for taking advantage of globalization. However, the megatrend in the world today is still globalization. The world is becoming smaller, and if you look at climate change, for example, no country can hide behind their national boundary, and mankind really needs to be united in so many initiatives that we are not saying goodbye to globalization.
Okay. Michael Maloof, of course, we see these changes taking place, shifting alliances, new economic powers that are emerging, and a number of countries in the world which have been truly alarmed by the manner in which the United States has imposed these sanctions on Russia. And the feeling is, look, if they could do it to Russia, they could do it to us as well. So they want to lessen their dependence on the United States, on other Western allies. They want to lessen their dependence on the United States dollar as well. But the other question is, how does the United States and its NATO allies respond to this? How do you think they're going to respond to this?
Well, I think it depends upon who the leadership is going to be. Clearly, Biden has pushed his own agenda, trying to push a leadership role that's diminishing in the world. And I think the United States and others who are using Biden for going up against Russia and containing Russia, maybe even seeking regime change, now are beginning to be diminished because the reality is setting in. Even the Europeans were pushed into this effort against Ukraine and against Russia. And I think Ukraine became a catalyst to accelerate this whole notion toward this multipolar notion that we've been talking about. Yeah. I think the Europeans, who are exporting countries, are going to be looking for alternative avenues for their exports, and that is eastward, because the United States, unless there's dramatic changes, which I don't envision right now in U.S. policy in the coming years, right, are going to be looking toward this alternative world order, and also coming under a separate financial system that separate from SWIFT.
Okay. Anton, Fedyashin, Western leaders talk about isolating Russia, about weakening Russia as well, but are they going to get to a point, and that point might not be far away, when they realize that they're going to have to live with Russia, perhaps under very different circumstances, perhaps under some kind of new global security arrangement, perhaps something that looks close to what Russia proposed in the first instance last December?
I think that's exactly where we're heading, and I don't think that point is ahead of us. There are already world leaders, especially in, well, not world, but European, Western leaders in Europe, who realize that, which is why they are beginning to make increasing sounds about the need to bring an end to the war in Ukraine through diplomacy yet again. And if you look at the very recent visit by the three Western European leaders to Kiev, the Chancellor of Germany, the President of France, the Prime Minister of Italy, on the surface, what we got, of course, was a commitment to Ukraine's and Moldova's candidate status for the EU, but I'm sure that behind closed doors, in exchange for that promise, the pressure was applied to Zelensky's government to hurry up and finish this, because again, as I've said earlier, never in the history of the world have sanctions imposed to punish one country had at least an equal, and in some cases, an even greater effect on the countries that have imposed those sanctions. And that's exactly what we're living through right now, what the West Europeans are living through right now.
Okay. And that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anton in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.